They were the kind of couple you might envy. George Smith IV, a tall, charismatic man from a tight-knit Connecticut family, had just married the woman he called the love of his life, Jennifer Hagel, a bright, energetic teacher with a future as promising as the summer sun. Their wedding was the stuff of dreams. Vows exchanged by the ocean, laughter filling the air, family and friends gathered in joy. Days later, George and Jennifer boarded a cruise ship, setting sail across the Mediterranean for what should have been the beginning of a beautiful life together. The air was filled with celebration, champagne toasts, and promises whispered into the salty breeze. For George and Jennifer, the world felt wide open, full of places to see, memories to build, and years to share. Until everything fell apart. One morning, passengers strolling the decks noticed something that would freeze the festive mood in its tracks. A dark bloodstain smeared across the canopy of a lifeboat, 20 feet below a balcony where laughter had echoed just hours earlier. George Smith was gone. No distress call. No goodbye. Just a smear of blood, an empty stateroom, and a void where a new husband should have been. In the hours that followed, confusion turned to fear. How could a healthy, newly married man simply vanish without a trace? The cruise line was quick to suggest an accident, too much celebration, a misstep, a fall into the sea. But the questions only grew heavier. Why was there blood below the balcony? Why were neighbors awakened by loud crashes from George and Jennifer's room that night? And why did the last people to see George alive later joke about his disappearance, laughing when there should have been nothing but grief? What began as a dream voyage was now a story whispered in corridors and replayed in news headlines. The young groom's fate became one of the most unsettling mysteries to ever unfold on the open water. Before we pull back the curtain on the haunting final days of George Smith, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because here we don't just tell stories, we reveal the ones you'll never forget. Was George the victim of a tragic accident? Or was there something much more disturbing hidden behind the smiles and clinking glasses of that floating city? Tonight, we trace the journey of two lives filled with promise, and the dark questions that still linger years after one of them vanished forever. A celebration of love, a night of confusion, and a disappearance that still refuses to be forgotten. This is the story of George Smith and Jennifer Hagel, and the honeymoon that ended in blood and silence. In the heart of Greenwich, Connecticut, where small-town charm meets quiet affluence, George Allen Smith IV grew up surrounded by love, tradition, and high expectations. His family was well known in the community not for flash or status, but for the steady way they built their lives. George's father, George Smith III, had turned Cos Cob Liquor into a neighborhood staple, a place where customers weren't just patrons, they were friends. George's mother, Maureen, brought her British warmth into the home, creating a household where family dinners and Sunday traditions weren't optional, they were the foundation. George was the kind of kid who made an impression without even trying. He had a sharp wit, an easy smile, and the kind of laugh that filled a room. On the football field at Greenwich High School, he wasn't the loudest or the flashiest, but his teammates remembered him as reliable, the one you wanted at your side when the game was on the line. When illness temporarily sidelined him from sports, George didn't fade into the background. Instead, he redirected his energy, diving into technology and business, two fields that fascinated him. That focus led him to Babson College, a place known for shaping young entrepreneurs. There, George found his stride, blending his knack for computers with a growing interest in business strategy. Friends from those years described him as grounded, the guy who could party with you on Saturday and then turn around and help you figure out your resume on Sunday. But no matter how far his ambitions stretched, home was always his center. Even after graduating and taking tech jobs in Stanford and Boston, George made time to come back, helping at Cos Cob Liquor during busy seasons, brainstorming ways to modernize the family business, and never missing a holiday gathering. Across Connecticut, in the quieter town of Cromwell, Jennifer Joyce Hagel was carving her own path. The daughter of a former police officer and a real estate agent, Jennifer grew up in a household where hard work was expected and dreams were encouraged. From an early age she stood out, not just for her bright blonde hair or easy laugh, but for a drive that seemed unusual for someone her age. School was never just a box to check for Jennifer. She attacked every subject with determination, often pushing herself harder than any teacher demanded. By the time she reached Trinity College in Hartford, it was clear she wasn't someone who let obstacles slow her down. Her professors praised her for being sharp, articulate, and fiercely committed to her goals. Jennifer wasn't content to coast through life. She had bigger plans, earning her degree, moving into education, and shaping young minds the way her own teachers had once shaped hers. Behind her ambition, though, was someone deeply connected to family. She stayed close to her roots, often returning home to celebrate milestones, support younger relatives, or simply sit around the dinner table trading stories. Friends described her as the kind of person who lit up a room without even realizing it. Someone who could hold her own in a conversation with anyone, yet was never too busy to check in on the people who mattered most. By her early 20s, Jennifer had not only completed her undergraduate studies but had already begun working toward her master's degree at Roger Williams University. She had plans to teach elementary school full-time, eager to leave her mark on a new generation of students. If George had been raised with a foundation of tradition and community, Jennifer was built from determination and heart. Two different backgrounds, two strong spirits, unknowingly moving toward a moment that would change everything. From opposite sides of Connecticut, George and Jennifer grew up chasing different dreams, but their core values mirrored each other. Loyalty to family, a hunger for something meaningful, and a belief that hard work could build a beautiful life. Both had lived what many would call charmed beginnings, not without challenges but filled with support, ambition, and a sense that the best was yet to come. When their paths finally crossed, it didn't feel accidental. It felt inevitable. Two people, raised with strong hands guiding them, now standing at the edge of something bigger than themselves. Together they looked like the kind of couple who could take on the world. He was steady, funny, and fiercely loyal. She was vibrant, driven, and endlessly full of life. Those who met them saw a future written in broad strokes. A family business thriving under new leadership, classrooms filled with young students eager to learn, a home filled with laughter and new traditions. George and Jennifer weren't just a couple in love. They were a picture of possibility, of everything that feels right when two lives built on hope finally find each other. But even the strongest beginnings can't always protect against the unexpected. Sometimes, life changes in ways no one can predict. Not with a grand event but with something as small as a broken shower. That summer, George was sharing a beach house in Newport, Rhode Island with a group of friends, savoring the simple joys of days on the sand and nights filled with laughter. The kind of summer that feels endless when you're young and the world seems full of wide-open chances. The plumbing in their house wasn't exactly reliable. One afternoon, when the shower sputtered and gave out midstream, George, dripping and annoyed, wandered upstairs to ask a neighbor if he could borrow theirs. That neighbor turned out to be connected to Jennifer. The first meeting wasn't the stuff of polished romance movies. It was casual, almost laughably ordinary, a towel around George's waist, a bit of awkward small talk, but something clicked. A glance held too long. A smile that felt genuine, not forced. What started as a polite conversation quickly stretched into hours of easy exchange, jokes, and quiet looks that spoke louder than words. Neither of them could have guessed, standing there in that worn-out beach house, that a broken shower had just rerouted the course of both their lives. In the weeks that followed, George and Jennifer became inseparable. Wherever one was, the other wasn't far behind. Late-night walks along the beach, lazy afternoons talking about everything and nothing, spontaneous dinners that stretched long into the night. It didn't feel rushed. It felt right. A steady, natural pull between two people who had somehow found in each other the pieces they hadn't even realized were missing. By the end of that summer, Jennifer had moved into George's apartment in Greenwich. Friends who visited could feel the shift immediately, framed photos side by side on the shelves, a warmth in the air that hadn't been there before. George, who had always been a little private about his personal life, couldn't stop talking about her. His sister, Bree, would later say that when George mentioned Jennifer, there was something different in his voice, something softer, surer. When Jennifer first met George's family, it didn't take long for them to see why he was so smitten. She lit up the room, Maureen Smith recalled. It wasn't just her bright smile or lively laugh, it was the way she made George better, more open, more alive. It wasn't long before talks of the future became part of everyday conversations. Plans for careers, hopes for travel, and quiet dreams of starting a family someday, it all came together easily like pieces clicking into place. There was no second-guessing. No hesitation. George had always been the steady one among his friends, but now, with Jennifer by his side, he seemed even more certain of the road ahead. Jennifer, too, found in George a kind of partnership she hadn't expected to stumble upon so soon. A man who wasn't just her boyfriend but her biggest supporter. Someone who believed in every goal she set and stood ready to celebrate every small victory. When George proposed, it wasn't about grand gestures or showy announcements. It was about a quiet promise, a future they were both eager to build together. In George's family, excitement buzzed louder with every passing month. Wedding plans took over family dinners, and Jennifer became woven into the Smiths' lives with a warmth that made her feel like she had always been there. To everyone who knew them, George and Jennifer weren't just planning a wedding. They were building a life, strong, certain, and full of the kind of love people spend their whole lives hoping to find. On the morning of June 25, 2005, George and Jennifer prepared to marry at Castle Hill Inn in Newport, Rhode Island. The ocean stretched out before them, the breeze soft, and excitement filled the air. George waited nervously at the altar, handsome in his suit. When Jennifer appeared, walking across the lawn, everything else seemed to disappear. She was radiant, her smile bright, her dress simple but perfect. They exchanged vows under the open sky, with tears and laughter mixed together. When they kissed, the guests erupted into warm, heartfelt applause. As the sun set, everyone moved inside for the reception, where soft lights and laughter created a dreamlike atmosphere. For their first dance, George and Jennifer chose Van Morrison's Into the Mystic, swaying together closely, lost in their moment. They didn't dance for the crowd, they danced for each other, a quiet promise to face life's storms together, side by side. After the final toast and the last spin around the dance floor, George and Jennifer were almost too excited to sleep. Their bags were already packed for the next chapter of their new life together. A 12-night Mediterranean cruise aboard Royal Caribbean's Brilliance of the Seas. It wasn't just a vacation. It was the beginning of everything they had dreamed about during late-night talks and quiet Sunday afternoons. Exploring new cities. Tasting unfamiliar foods. Waking up each morning in a different port with nothing on the agenda but adventure and each other. The ship would carry them from Spain to Italy, through the Greek Isles, weaving them deeper into a story that, until now, had been written only in their hopes and plans. Hand in hand, full of laughter and expectation, George and Jennifer boarded their flight. They left behind the familiar streets of Greenwich and stepped into a future they could almost touch. Neither of them knew it yet, but that journey would be remembered for reasons no one could have ever imagined. Brilliance of the Seas was a floating world of endless possibility. 12 decks of restaurants, pools, casinos, and theaters, all framed by the endless shimmer of the Mediterranean. For George and Jennifer, it felt like stepping into a storybook written just for them. Their days fell into an easy rhythm. Breakfast overlooking the sea. Afternoons exploring ancient streets in cities like Villefranche and Florence. Evenings spent clinking wine glasses and swapping stories with fellow travelers. George, always the social one, made friends quickly. Jennifer, with her bright smile and easy charm, wasn't far behind. In the photographs taken during those early days, they looked every bit the newlyweds they were, arms wrapped around each other, laughing against the backdrop of stone alleys and turquoise waters. No deadlines. No responsibilities. Just time stretching wide and full of promise. It was everything they had hoped their honeymoon would be. Among the many faces they encountered on board, a few became more than just passing acquaintances. George and Jennifer first connected with Josh Eskin, a college student from California traveling with his family. Josh was young, full of easy jokes, and eager to make new friends. The bond formed naturally, casual conversations at the casino tables, shared laughter over late-night drinks. It wasn't long before they also crossed paths with 3 other young men, Gregory Rosenberg, Zachary Rosenberg, and Rostislav Rusty Kaufman. All of them were close in age to George, and like many vacation friendships, things escalated quickly. Dinners turned into drinks. Drinks turned into long conversations on deck chairs under the stars. There was a sense of camaraderie, a feeling that, for a few days at least, strangers could become companions in a place suspended far from real life. George welcomed the company. He had always been someone who thrived on connection, and the energy of the group suited his easygoing spirit. Jennifer seemed to enjoy it too, although those closest to her would later wonder if, beneath her friendliness, she sensed something different. Because on vacation, everyone seems like a friend. Until they aren't. As the ship moved from port to port, George and Jennifer's days stayed sun-soaked and full of easy smiles. Photos captured them against the backdrop of whitewashed villages and sunlit harbors, their arms linked, their faces glowing with the kind of happiness that seemed impossible to touch. But small things, barely noticeable at first, began to weave into the edges of their story. The late-night gatherings grew a little rowdier. The group of new friends, once just a handful of familiar faces, started to feel more like a constant presence. More drinks. Longer nights. New energy around them that didn't always match the gentle rhythm George and Jennifer had built together. Still, it was easy to brush aside. They were young. They were celebrating. What could possibly go wrong surrounded by laughter, bright lights, and the open sea? But who you meet on vacation isn't always who you think they are. And sometimes, it's the smiles you trust most that hide the dangers you never see coming. July 4th had been another perfect day. George and Jennifer spent the afternoon wandering the sun-bleached streets of Mykonos, sampling seafood fresh from the docks, ducking into tiny shops that smelled of leather and salt. By the time they returned to the ship, the Mediterranean sun had left them glowing, tired, and happy. That evening they dressed for dinner, Jennifer in a flowing sundress, George in a crisp shirt he had picked out just for the trip. They shared a bottle of wine, laughed easily with other couples they had befriended, and made plans for the next day's port. There was no sign, not yet, that anything was wrong. Later that night they drifted into the ship's casino, a familiar routine by now. George gravitated toward the craps table, laughing and tossing dice alongside the usual group of young men they had come to know. Jennifer wandered toward the blackjack tables, her voice carrying across the room in bursts of excitement. Drinks flowed easily. Too easily. By midnight, the casual drinking had turned into rounds of shots. Absinthe, vodka, champagne. The lines between celebration and carelessness began to blur. At some point after midnight the mood shifted. Witnesses would later describe a scene that grew louder, sharper, more chaotic as the hours wore on. Near the bar George and Jennifer were seen arguing, not a quiet disagreement, but something raw enough to draw glances from nearby tables. Their words were too low to catch in full, but the anger was obvious. Jennifer, struggling to steady herself, leaned into one of the young men nearby, maybe for balance, maybe to push George's buttons. Whatever her reason, it worked. George's face darkened, his posture stiffened, and sharp words followed, cutting across the noise of the casino. In a flash of frustration, Jennifer lashed out. A kick, sudden and unfiltered, caught George squarely in the groin. He doubled over, grimacing, while the laughter and music around them blurred into something distant. Jennifer didn't wait for a reaction. She turned and stormed away, disappearing into the maze of hallways that twisted through the ship's lower decks. George stayed behind, trying to catch his breath, humiliated, angry, and far more intoxicated than he realized. The night, once full of laughter, had splintered into something fragile and dangerous. Left alone, George found company in the only people still lingering near him, the same young men he had gambled and joked with over the past few days. Joshua Skin, Gregory Rosenberg, Zachary Rosenberg, Rusty Kaufman. They circled back around him, offering slurred encouragements, refilling his glass, pushing the night forward when it should have ended long ago. The drinks didn't stop. Neither did the reckless energy. George could barely stand now. His movements were heavy, uncoordinated, his words slipping into mumbles. By around 4 a.m., it was obvious even to his intoxicated companions that he couldn't make it back to his cabin on his own. So they grabbed his arms, one on each side, and half-carried, half-dragged him down the narrow hallways towards stateroom 9062. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a group of friends helping out a buddy who had celebrated too hard. But what happened after George crossed that doorway is something no one can say for certain. Because from that point on, the story blurs, and the echoes of what followed would leave questions that still haunt the case today. According to the young men, they left George slumped on his bed after pulling off his shoes and tucking him in as best they could. The lights were switched off, the door closed behind them, and they vanished back into the ship's endless corridors. But the ship wasn't asleep. Not entirely. From behind the thin walls of nearby cabins, other passengers later described hearing strange sounds. A heavy thud. Furniture scraping against metal floors. Low voices, raised, urgent, too muffled to catch the words but loud enough to rattle nerves. One neighbor, a retired law enforcement officer, would later recall lying awake, frozen in bed, listening to the chaos just a few feet away through the walls. And then, silence. Abrupt and unsettling, like a record scratched to a halt. What would you have done if you heard thuds and crashes in the middle of the night, alone in a stateroom far from home? Would you have opened your door? Would you have called for help? Let me know in the comments below, because sometimes the choices we don't make are the ones that stay with us the longest. By morning, the ship moved as if the night before had never happened. The sun rose quietly over the open water, casting a golden light across the decks, where passengers sipped coffee and prepared for another day of sightseeing. But just after 7:30 a.m., everything shifted. Several guests, out for early walks along the lower decks, looked up and froze. There, stretched across the white canopy above a lifeboat, was a dark stain, large, heavy, unmistakable. Blood. Not a small smear. Not something that could be explained away easily. It pooled across the surface, glaring under the rising sun, a silent alarm that something had gone terribly wrong. Crew members rushed to the scene. Security officers whispered into radios. The relaxed atmosphere fractured in an instant as word spread. Someone was missing. It didn't take long to trace the bloodstain back to its source. Directly above the lifeboat canopy was the balcony of stateroom 9062, George and Jennifer's room. When crew members entered the cabin, they found the space eerily still. The bed was rumpled. George's belongings were scattered as if the night had ended in a rush. But there was no sign of George himself. Jennifer, disoriented and confused, had been found elsewhere hours earlier, sleeping off the chaos of the night in a different part of the ship. Now the pieces didn't fit. A missing groom. A balcony overlooking a lifeboat smeared with blood. An abandoned room. Panic rippled through the corridors. Announcements were made over the loudspeaker, first casually, then with rising urgency. Crew members began checking every corner of the ship, from bars to storage rooms to the lower engine decks. The captain eventually ordered a full sweep of the waters in the ship's wake. But George Smith was gone. No sightings. No notes. No goodbye. Just a stain baking under the rising sun and an unanswered question hanging heavy in the air. Within hours, a message was delivered to passengers. There had been an incident overnight involving one of their fellow guests. The tone was measured, careful. No details, just reassurances that the situation was under control. Behind closed doors, however, the conversations were much less polished. Some crew members speculated openly. Others whispered behind cupped hands. The first official theory floated to the surface quickly. George had been drinking heavily. He must have lost his balance. A tragic accident, they said. An unfortunate misstep from a private balcony into the endless black of the sea. It was a story that seemed to fit the surface facts. It was also a story that asked people to ignore the blood. Ignore the thuds neighbors heard through the walls. Ignore the confusion surrounding George's final hours. Ignore the uneasy feeling that spread faster than any announcement ever could. While some were ready to accept the idea of a terrible accident, others on board, and certainly those back home, were already asking harder questions. Because sometimes, the easy answers are the ones that crumble first. When the Brilliance of the Seas docked in Kusadasi, Turkey, it was not greeted with eager tourists rushing to explore. Instead, local authorities boarded the vessel, officers in plain clothes, cameras slung over their shoulders, notebooks at the ready. The Turkish police worked quickly but carefully. They moved through the ship, interviewing staff, passengers, and anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual during the night George Smith disappeared. Royal Caribbean's own security team also launched its internal review, though some later questioned whether their primary goal was clarity or containment. The passengers who had been closest to George in his final hours, Josh Askin, Gregory Rosenberg, Zachary Rosenberg, and Rusty Kaufman, were among the first called in for questioning. Each of them told similar stories. George had been drinking heavily. They had helped him back to his cabin. He was left safely inside. None of them had any idea what happened after that. Their answers matched almost too perfectly. And for investigators trained to spot the gaps between words, the smoothness of those accounts was a red flag, not a reassurance. It didn't take long for something even more troubling to surface. Not long after the interviews, investigators got hold of a video, filmed casually by some of the young men the morning after George disappeared. In the footage, they sat around a table, laughing, passing a camera back and forth, making crude jokes about George's fate. At one point, Rusty Kaufman smirked and quipped that George had gone parachute riding, a disgusting attempt at humor given the circumstances. Gregory Rosenberg leaned into the lens, flashing hand signs and bragging, "Told ya I was gangsta," while others around him chuckled. There was no grief, no shock, no hint that any of them truly understood, or cared, that a man was missing, likely dead. Watching the video felt like being punched in the gut. For George's family, it was more than tastelessness. It was a window into the mindset of the last people who had seen him alive. And it raised a darker question. Were they laughing because they knew something nobody else did? As investigators dug deeper, another possible motive began to take shape. George wasn't just another tourist blending into the crowd. He stood out, young, newly married, flashing a bright watch on his wrist, speaking freely about the cash he and Jennifer had received as wedding gifts. Some passengers remembered overhearing casual conversations where George joked about the money they had locked away in the safe inside their cabin. Maybe it was harmless boasting. Maybe it wasn't. An expensive Breitling watch. Talk of thousands in cash. Too much alcohol. Too many new friends, who had only known him for a few days. The idea that George had been targeted, not because of who he was, but because of what he might have been carrying, suddenly didn't seem far-fetched. Maybe he hadn't fallen. Maybe someone helped him over that railing. And maybe it had nothing to do with anger or arguments. Maybe it was about greed. Theories spread faster than facts, but behind closed doors investigators were starting to wonder if the night George vanished had begun with celebration, and ended with something much colder. Back home in Connecticut, the news of George's disappearance hit like a landslide. Shock gave way to sorrow. Sorrow hardened into determination. George's parents, George Smith III and Maureen Smith, refused to accept simple explanations. Their son wasn't reckless. He wasn't careless. They believed with every fiber of their being that something terrible had been done to him, and they were determined to find out who was responsible. At first, Jennifer stood with them, grieving, publicly calling for answers, appearing alongside the Smith family at media interviews, pleading for justice. But as weeks turned into months, cracks began to show. Jennifer's grief took a different shape, one that led her toward settlement talks with Royal Caribbean, while the Smith family pushed for criminal accountability. The lines between them, once united by loss, slowly began to pull apart. In 2007, Jennifer reached a settlement agreement with Royal Caribbean. The amount, $1.1 million, came with no admission of wrongdoing from the cruise line. It was, in legal terms, a resolution. But to George's family, it felt like surrender. They believed Jennifer had settled too soon with too many questions still unanswered. They felt blindsided, learning about the agreement through lawyers instead of family conversations. For them, it wasn't about the money. It was about the truth. The news widened the distance between Jennifer and the Smiths into something deeper, a break that would never fully heal. Publicly, George's parents voiced their heartbreak. Privately, they turned their grief into fuel, refusing to let George's story be quietly closed by legal paperwork. If no one else would fight for him, they would. The Smith family didn't just fight in private. They took their battle into the public eye. They pushed for congressional hearings, demanding better protections for passengers on cruise ships. They sat before lawmakers and told George's story, not just the joyful parts, but the messy, painful truth of what happens when tragedy strikes in international waters and answers are hard to find. Their testimony wasn't filled with polished sound bites. It was raw, filled with the kind of heartbreak that lingers in a room long after the cameras stop rolling. And their efforts mattered. Their voice, along with others, helped spark a broader conversation about cruise ship safety, accountability, and the rights of families left behind. They turned their private nightmare into a public call for change, ensuring that George's name wouldn't be just a headline that faded away. It would stand for something bigger. 4 years, George's family waited for the call they hoped would bring answers. They gave interviews, pushed for evidence reviews, held on to every shred of hope that the investigation would uncover the truth. But in 2015, a full decade after George disappeared, the call came, and it wasn't the one they had prayed for. The FBI announced it was closing the case. No charges. No arrests. No further action. The explanation was cold and clinical. After exhaustive efforts, the Bureau could not gather enough evidence to pursue a criminal case. Whether by accident, foul play, or something in between, George's fate would remain officially unsolved. For George's family, it was a second loss, different from the first but just as painful. George's parents were devastated. They had believed in the system. Believed that if they just kept fighting, kept telling his story, justice would eventually find its way through the cracks. Now, it felt like their son was being left behind, again. Publicly, they made their stance clear. "We won't let this case die," George's father said during a press conference, his voice steady but broken underneath. They vowed to keep pushing, to keep asking, even if official investigations had gone silent. To this day, the truth remains tangled. Did George stumble over that balcony alone after a night of too much alcohol? Did a robbery plan turn violent when he tried to resist? Or did something darker happen behind that closed cabin door, something that only a few people on that ship truly know? If you believe George Smith's case deserves justice, hit that like button. Let's keep his story alive, because silence should never be the final word. In the years that followed, life carried forward, but not for everyone in the same way. Jennifer eventually remarried, finding a new path in a different chapter of her life. She moved forward, but not without shadows trailing behind. Whenever asked about George, she spoke with a tenderness that never fully faded, a quiet acknowledgement that no matter how much time passed, some losses never fully leave you. For George's family, moving on was never an option. Instead, they transformed their grief into action. They became tireless advocates for safety reforms, pushing for protections that would help prevent other families from living through the kind of nightmare that had shattered their own. Their voices were among those that helped bring change, real change. In 2010, the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act was signed into law. It required stricter reporting of crimes at sea, better security measures on ships, and greater protections for passengers. A step forward that came too late for George, but not for others who would sail those waters in the future. It wasn't the justice George's family had hoped for. But it was a legacy, hard one, and born from the pain they refused to let be forgotten. George's body was never found. No grave marks his resting place. But his story still echoes across the sea, carried by the families who fight, the laws that now stand, and the quiet memory of a young man who boarded a ship for a honeymoon and never came home. If you want more haunting true crime stories that make you think, subscribe now, because the next story might just change the way you see the world.